Thank you all for attending today, this last webinar in the series of free webinars. The book that I wrote is very much focused on the examples and the lived experiences of people of color, and I think it's critically important to pay attention to that. So this webinar is going to be a really personal one. I literally want to take a page out of my own book and talk about the lived experiences, but I wanted to do it in terms of a conversation. And so I thought, who better to have that conversation with than another fellow psychologist who is an anti-racism researcher and wrote the foreword for my book, Dr. Monica Williams. So Monica, I'll let you say a little bit about yourself and then we'll get started.
Oh, thank you. And I just want to say I'm so pleased to be here today with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Abdulrehman, to talk about his remarkable journey from immigrant boy to inclusion and diversity expert. And I can tell you, being a diversity expert is no easy job. I'll tell you just briefly a little bit about myself and my work. I'm a tenured professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. I moved here about 4.5 years ago from the United States. I'm a Canada Research Chair for Mental Health Disparities and also the clinical director of the Behavioral Wellness Clinics in Connecticut and Ottawa. I'm also board certified in behavioral and cognitive psychology, and most of my research is on the mental health of people of color. So that's one of the books I've written on the screen, Managing Microaggressions. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here to have this conversation today. So is there anything else you want to add, Raymond?
No, it's just a real pleasure. I think there's been a lot of synchronicity in having you write the foreword for my book, and now, having this conversation together. These are nice opportunities to further these conversations. So thank you for being here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. So I will be the host today, and I'll be kicking off this interview with my first question for you really is, how did you become interested in studying bias?
Yeah. I think each of us tells our own stories. I think there's the conscious decisions we make and then the subconscious decisions that we make. And consciously, I think, as a psychologist who practices and understands the role of thoughts and cognitions on the impact of our behaviors and the resulting emotions, I recognize and value the learning and understanding of how those thoughts and those biases develop, because they really are almost like the decision point that determines our trajectories in life. That they say each choice is a decision or is a window into opening a part of yourself. And I think consciously, in a nerdy fashion, I love that piece. But if I were to really be thoughtful, I think subconsciously I've lived with this sense of bias for my entire life. My family hails from Zanzibar, and we have a mixed ethnic lineage, and so I've always been that ambiguously brown person. And that question, where are you from, but where are you really from, when they finally, has been a thing that's plagued me for my entire life. And it has shown up as such a critical question. And I think it is a question for many people of color that agitates, our identity. So much so that I did a TEDx talk on it. I think that personal part of being plagued and haunted with that question of where are you from, and not even just that, but what are you? The need, like this, I think this bias that somehow we must all fit into these stereotypical boxes of racial criteria that it blows people's minds when you don't fit into that. And so I think having been plagued with that, I think that's my awareness of the subconscious decision of why studying bias is so critically important for me.
Yeah. I have to say, I have really grown to hate that question. What are you? Right?
Yeah.
Because I think people really feel like they feel very uncomfortable if they can't figure out which box to put you in.
Hmm.
And I think it's really just all about figuring out how am I going to stereotype you based on what you tell me about what you are.
Yes, absolutely. And I think becoming a prisoner of those stereotypes is a really difficult experience for many people of color. Um, and I think like I think I've spent my life trying very hard to break out of those stereotypes, but no matter how hard you try, I think they always get placed upon you. And so what better way to help make change, I think, than to help people understand why they think what they think. Um, and that's been very important to me.
Yeah. Now, you came to Canada as a young child. Tell us
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah, and it's certainly a very valuable and rich part of my life and history. And I'm never ashamed of it, but I'm always hesitant to talk about it because I think having that label, I think automatically has people jump to certain conclusions about you. You think about biases, so I was an immigrant. I'm not currently an immigrant. I was not recently an immigrant. But along with that come these beliefs about being a foreigner, about being an outsider, and certain stereotypes of what that means, including, I mean, even the title of this talk, right? From immigrant boy to inclusion expert, I mean, really begs this question of being a good immigrant. Here you are, a success story. You know, you were granted the opportunity to come to Canada and you've made it. You know, this is a classic success story. And it wasn't like that, right? Like, I mean, I think people of color, growing up, we're told by our parents that you have to work harder than the average white person. And I know that's hard for people to hear, but in terms of lived experience, I've watched colleagues of mine get further ahead on very little. Um, because they didn't always have the barriers and the boundaries of racism and bias and stereotypes. So, I'm thankful for the privilege that I've gained. Um, but I moved here when I was 7 from Tanzania. And for me, it was understanding that part of myself and wrestling with that part of myself and wrestling with what's projected upon me. Um, that was critically important to my journey, I think, not just to immigrate here, but my journey in life, I think, and doing the work that I do.
Mhm.
I think it also really bothers me. I'm particularly bothered by, I mean, I spoke about this earlier, but I think it's probably a bee in my bonnet about being this ambiguous brown. And I remember moving here and like in my heart and in my mind, my family was Zanzibari. I grew up in Dar es Salaam and that was just who I was, right? And then having to come face to face with not my understanding of who I was, but people's understanding of what they expected is like, oh, where are you from? And earlier, of course, as your identity is more different as an immigrant, the answer is always, my family's from Zanzibar, I'm Tanzanian, and they're like, that's in Africa. Yes, you're not black. And, and to be like faced with that and like, yeah, I'm not black, but now having to reconcile your identity with somebody else's stereotype of what they expect Africans to look like. Uh, so
Yeah.
that's been my journey. It was an interesting one, but one I certainly cherish. But I'm always tentative about talking about because I don't want to have to live up to people's expectations or stereotypes of what they expect of me.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That word immigrant is so loaded. I mean, I am actually an immigrant from the United States. Nobody thinks of me as an immigrant because we have all these ideas about what that actually means about people.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's interesting we don't look at white immigrants the same way either.
I,
We have a lot of white immigrants, and because they have the privilege of passing as what people think is local, they don't have the same barriers. But the moment an immigrant is a person of color, then they're saddled with all of those stereotypes and expectations.
yeah, so true, so
Yeah.
true. Now, did you experience racism when you came to Canada, or did you and your family find it to be a utopian,
Yeah.
multicultural melting pot?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and for Canada here, it's this, so to speak, mosaic, or we're told. I can't tell you like the depth of racism that my family and I experienced. That black and white photograph is, um, you know, of me and my brother and my father, like in a mall that no longer exists, in a little photo booth, when we first got here. And my father had arrived to Canada much earlier to set up shop and to make sure that there was stability for his family. And you can see the happiness on his face, right? Like just the joy. This is like on the earlier days when we first arrived. Um, but it wasn't just personal racism. It's like it's watching the people that you love being subjected to that. And as a child, watching your parents suffer through, the grief of being marginalized and discriminated against on a regular basis, and really impacting the quality of our lives. We didn't grow up very well off. Um, my father and my mother were very hardworking people, um, and they did everything they could to make things work. But due to racism, the opportunities were far and fewer between. And yet, being the good immigrant, my parents worked hard. My father worked really hard to move on to management. He would end up managing stores, and then he would take a store to like a high level, uh, get tons of awards, and then would be told, "You're hiring too many immigrants and people of color. You need to hire more white people than people of color." And my father, and I'm happy to say I have this trait from him, is very stubborn on matters tied to this. And he's like, "I'll hire anybody. I've made these stores successful, and I'll hire anybody that I see fit that would help move this business forward." And he'd be fired for that. And that was a consistent thing. And then after years of moving forward, all these businesses eventually ran into some stagnation. And I remember the grief uh, of him being unemployed for long periods of time and trying to apply for jobs and running into the, language that would describe that, you're not white enough to work here. And I remember this one time he applied for this, he repeatedly go for this job interview with a stationery company. And they kept interviewing him, and he's like, "I'm not getting the job." And he eventually just said, like, you've interviewed me like several times. Are you going to be offering me the job?" And they said, "No, we just wanted to have our staff know what it was like to interview somebody like yourself."
Mm.
And, so using people of color to create this diversity training and then not offer the opportunity, right? And I remember the grief that he experienced and me watching that as a child. Like racism doesn't just impact individuals, it impacts families, it impacts communities. And it was when I think that there was just what felt like no hope. And you see a lot of immigrant families do this where they just open their own business. And sadly, that's a stereotype, right? Like if you think about, stereotypes of Arab and South Asian and immigrant families and Asian families who own restaurants and businesses. I mean, those are stereotypes and we're made fun of for that. But it's often because there's just been no other option. and racism had put up all these barriers for that other people think that, so, we're here to take your jobs. We're actually creating jobs because we're not offered those. The jobs that we are offered are the ones that are menial and subversive. Um, but thankfully, like, again, this was not a success story that that the opportunity of being in Canada afforded us. It was really just the last option where my parents opened and ran what is now the oldest running halal meat shop um, in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and is in some ways a historic landmark here in the city, um, well known by the press, and at times after 9/11, well known by CSIS, who used to enjoy parking outside the store for a long period of time. But they've had that success. And this is my father, very proud, outside a mural.
Wait. So the government was surveilling your parents and your store?
Yeah, I mean, post 9/11, absolutely. They didn't just surveil me and my family and our store, but they surveilled many members of our community, right? And um, this fear of us being terrorists. And so, we're not really even made to feel comfortable in our own homes, in our own countries. And I would say Canada is my country. Um, but thankfully, I mean, they've been very successful in terms of having this long-standing business that's really become, I think, a landmark in the city. The mural, everybody knows the mural, and it's become and I think this is part of the reason, I think, for the surveillance, is that it became a hub for the community, right? Like, it's like where there's no opportunity, I find people without that opportunity create that opportunity. And I mean, uh, that shop has been that shop has been like a counseling center. That shop has been a chapel where people have got married in the back room. I mean, that little shop in the back has been a little mosque where people are just in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by to pray at prayer time. So, I mean, we create our little communities, but the dilemma here is that we're not always allowed into a broader community, and the broader community doesn't always see us as a part of a larger community.
Mm, wow. Now, did you also face racism as a child growing up?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But it's interesting when you don't have the language for it, you just feel like an idiot because people make you feel like an idiot. I'll give you a really good example. So, um, I remember in grade 3, there was this girl who um, had brought lilacs in to the class and was smelling them. And actually, for some reason, the scent was bothering me. And I asked the teacher if she could just put those away. And the teacher, a white woman, said, "Raymond, how dare you? That is our provincial flower." And the interesting thing is, a lilac is not the Manitoba provincial flower. A crocus is. So, but I mean, as a child, I mean, you face this kind of discrimination on a regular basis. I remember my younger brother, when he was in grade 2, telling his friend that Santa Claus doesn't exist, that's no such thing. And of course, we don't believe in Santa Claus. And the child's mother tearing into him, "How dare you tell my child Santa Claus doesn't exist?" At school, in front of the teachers, nobody intervening, and so the sense of entitlement and supremacy that exists, where it's not just, to me, racism and discrimination isn't just about ethnicity and race. It is about culture and this cultural supremacy. And I talk about it in my book, that the concept of whiteness isn't just tied to this physical manifestation of our phenotype, but a culture of whiteness that we expect to be supreme and dominant every single time.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. I think so many white people don't really think consciously about that, even though perhaps that is often the expectation in spaces where there are diverse people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, the concept of identity is far more than our phenotype. our phenotype, our ethnicity, and our race produces an experience. And that is a cultural experience that other people cannot have. There's some that we can adopt, but there's some that you just can't get unless you belong to that particular community. Some of it's cultural, some of it's tied to our presentation. There's people within our community that pass as white. They will have a different experience culturally than those of us who don't pass as white.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
Um, Now, I would love to hear you say a little bit more about why you decided to pursue a career in psychology.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I think that there's those conscious decisions that we think we've had choices of. And then I think that there's our history and our culture that we get pulled back into. So being an immigrant, and most immigrant families will know that you've got parents who are telling you you've got three options for your career. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. From my father in particular, you could only be a physician. That was your option. And it's interesting because the rationale for that for him was he had his job removed from him on a regular basis simply because he stood up for inclusion. And and he never wanted his children to have that experience. So his belief was that he's like, everybody always needs a doctor. Like nobody can ever take that away from you. And I guess his belief was that there would not be as much racism in a professional sector, which he was wrong about, and we'll talk about later. But it's interesting, like, um, so I was like, well, I don't want to do that. I wanted to figure out why people did things, and I realized that medicine explored how people did things, like not why. And so I wanted to get into psychology. Um, but I have this little lamp here, like this is like a genie's lamp, and this comes from our tradition in Zanzibar. Like the concept of the jinn and the metaphysical and the spiritual are all really intertwined with culture. Um, and it's interesting, as much as we try to separate ourselves and show ourselves as westernized and scientific, like our spiritual and our cultural beliefs are critically important. And I think the more we try to separate ourselves from them, I think the more danger that we have. And it's interesting that 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 spiritual or cultural perspective that sometimes we're almost like there's a sense of inheritance, you know, and like our traits culturally were inherited. Like you're like this person, you're inherited those qualities. And so I did this best to separate myself, from what my father's wishes were. And here I am full circle now, working as a psychologist, working on inclusion, working with organizations to address racism. I mean, it wasn't intentional, so that they don't do to other people what happened to my father, right? Like, talk about full circle. And my father, who moved here to Canada, tried to establish himself, grew up. That's a photograph of my great grandfather there in his fez cap. And he was a confectioner. And he used to make all sorts of confections, including halwa or lahom, like a Turkish delight. And we have that recipe that's come down for many generations. I was just chowing on some last night. Um, and my father grew up with that experience. And as much as he tried to move and go into business and establish himself, but as a manager, he ended up opening his own business, his own store where we're selling our own sweets and our own specialty foods. So he was tied to that. And then I think further, like it's funny, like our family is known in our community as the confectioners. Like that's, how people can be like masons and all those kinds of things. Like we are known. And I never sought out to, so to speak. And it was our tradition that, people from this community or that trade, like you always have a sweet tooth. Like you're always good at this sort of stuff. And I'm shocked because anybody who knows me knows I got a real thing for cake. I would say I'm a bit of a confectioner myself, right? And I didn't consciously choose that, but how much of us are tied to these like inheritances of our family and cultural history that provide a great richness in our identity that I think I work to embrace, and I think we need to work to embrace.
Yeah. Well, I know for a fact you make some pretty amazing pastries. And
Thanks. Yeah. I'm particularly proud of my Sophia Petrillo cake, which I made for my own birthday this past year. So that's been my pride and joy.
oh yes, well, that was something, boy. It's amazing how these things just seem like they come right down the family tree.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting.
Um, so I also so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your experience now, in terms of, well, maybe how some of these issues, racism, discrimination, stereotypes, xenophobia, how did it show up for you in your higher educational pursuits?
Yeah. I mean, this shit haunts you like as much as it does, as much as your cultural history. Like I talk about in my book about how you cannot separate the experience of racism and discrimination from the identity and the cultural experience of people of color because it's so much a part of our experience that it almost becomes infused as a part of who you are. Um, I mean, I I think most of us experience racism, but we just kind of put it aside. We keep trying to say, that's not that, that's not that. And then the more you experience it, the more aware you become, the more you recognize that, no, this is a legitimate form of racism. And even in our professional life, how many times I've had somebody say some pretty racist things to me. But a simple thing, I remember being annoyed that the average white guy could get away with wearing jeans and a t-shirt and be taken credibly. And I'm me showing up in grad school like I wasn't taken seriously. And so in order to counteract that, I always had to show up in a tie and a shirt. And I always liked a tie and a shirt, but I really wanted to just show up in a jeans and jeans and a t-shirt. Um, and but in order to be afforded that privilege, like I had to get to this point now. Now, if I show up to work in jeans and a t-shirt, nobody would think anything of it. But I had to work so hard to gain that credibility. Whereas in grad school, like student therapists who show up, in casual clothes would still be offered that credibility. And for me, it wasn't. I think about my brother, who's a vascular surgeon, who makes the attempt of always wearing his lab coat when he's in clinic to see patients, because if he isn't, patients automatically assume that he's their taxi driver, and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not ready for my cab yet. I'm waiting for my surgeon." He's like, "I am your surgeon." Um,
Well,
so when we think about how we dress, and I always say that my privilege disappears the moment I leave my office, whereas other people have that with them regardless of their profession.
hmm,
And
yeah.
then yeah, and so there's that. And it's now that like I'm actually studying this work, and this is actually the results of one question from the bias outside the box test, or testbias.com, where we ask people which person is most likely to challenge Western values. Um, and the person who was most likely perceived to challenge Western values was me. I mean, I was a Muslim and an Arab, right? Like,
Yeah,
and
that's you in the picture.
that's me in the picture, right? And the interesting thing is that before we published this, I sent this out to colleagues of mine to do test runs, and they knew that was me, and they still suggested I was there challenging Western values. And I think there's a threatening aspect. And you notice the second other person is like an indigenous woman. So being a person of color, being indigenous, I mean, we're often seen as threatening, and it doesn't matter what we do. And I think the more we embrace our cultural identity, the more of a threat it becomes. And hence the pressure to assimilate is really an act of racism in its own, because the moment we own our identity, it becomes threatening. You can see that uh, you know, both myself and the indigenous woman in that photograph were wearing cultural dress. And that's frightening and threatening to people. And there's another question, as a woman of color, when she's dressed in Western clothes is seen as a highly qualified medical professional. So again, triggering that good immigrant bias. But there's threat, and we're seen as a threat, and we're constantly seen as a threat. And I have behind there the keffiyeh, which is a Palestinian scarf, but it's also worn in many other Arab traditions and cultures. Um, as a part of their cultural dress is a sign of solidarity. And that sense of solidarity is frightening, I think, often in a racist society because we become more of a threat. And I remember after 9/11, I mean, these are not just historical examples, but we see that there's a connection of dots. After 9/11, the faculty all gathered for a meeting. And it was my supervisor who approached me after, and she was stunned. And she's like, I'm really shocked, but this really well-known and senior faculty member with tenure suggested that we needed to kill them all because they're terrorists. And we fast forward to today, and that is the rhetoric being used to justify a genocide happening in Palestine. Right. I mean, that these people are terrorists. They would not allow gay people in. They don't have equal human rights. They don't treat women right. And so we're seen as this threat. And now it is literally being used to kill them all. That it's been described that Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, that there is no innocent child, that none of them are innocent. And that's a very frightening thing for a broader identity tied to being a Muslim, tied to being Arab, tied to being Palestinian, South Asian and Muslim, people of color. And we see those all ties coming together where it doesn't just show up. We often think that these are matters that my father thought, it wouldn't exist in a professional world. And yet here we are. This tool that I developed, I got so much hate mail from this tool alone. It's striking. Now, I always find it really comical when I get emails. I get literal emails. People have gone and searched me out, found my email, and have emailed me about how biased they think my test is after just finishing one question. I mean, I remember being a little bit perturbed filling out the Facebook quiz on which Sex and the City character are you, and I'm like, I'm not Samantha. I mean, I did not have the annoyance to go and find the creator of that little Facebook quiz and email them to say that, hey, I'm not Samantha. And that's exactly what happened here. People send me an email and say, I'm not biased, I'm not racist, and, thou doth protest too much.
Oh my goodness. Yes. I mean, you're now like well established, you're successful, and it would be tempting to think that dealing with discrimination is behind you. But it sounds like this just has not stopped. How else has this shown up for you in your career as a clinical and consulting psychologist?
Well, I actually think it makes you more of a target. I think the more you stand up for this stuff, the more of a target you become. It doesn't make your life easier. It makes it more difficult. Um,
Mm,
I mean, I know I've spoken out publicly about the need for a ceasefire, and I think it's a very psychological thing to think about, cycles of violence that perpetuate danger to more than one community. I think we often think about it just impacting people of color, but we need to recognize that racism and acts of racism and genocide also impact the safety and well-being of a broader community, of a non-racialized community.
yeah.
Um, and I mean, I've been targeted. Anonymous messages, threats, threats of like professional misconduct, threats that how could I, an inclusion psychologist, speak out against this and misinformation? And I'm like, well, I mean, I am an expert in this stuff. So if you want to have a conversation, that's great. We'll have a conversation. But this sense of entitlement that you are not allowed to speak up. So it does make it much harder. But also even within professional circles, to see other professionals, other psychologists openly talking about people from my community being evil. And and this is where it's important to recognize that racism is not just tied to white people. I always say this, but these are other psychologists of color talking about how Arab and Muslim people are evil.
Hmm.
This is a battle between darkness and light, like, so I'm not sure that being successful, I don't even know what that means, to be honest. Um, I, I think there's a colleague of mine, Dr. Shabazz, who talks about paying rent on this earth. And to me, I don't see this as successful. I just see this as this is the job that I do. And I see this as rent. I love that metaphor um, of having space on this earth. But I think as you, I think, and Monica, I think you know this experience, and you probably speak to some of these experiences. I think the more open and vocal you become about resolving a very critical issue that impacts all of us in society, the more likely you are to be open to attack.
Absolutely. I mean, as a professional woman of color myself, I can certainly speak to the fact that racism has been a stressor for me. It's impacted my career. I've been at several different universities, and it's common to hear people say, "Oh, that's amazing. You've been so many places." And it's like, I didn't want to be all those places. I literally was driven away due to racism.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, sometimes, if I kind of put my head down and been like, okay, I'm just going to teach this multicultural class and not do cutting edge research and not talk about racism and not advance solutions, then people would be so much more comfortable, with my presence. And at the same time, I find that these things do accumulate. They do cause stress. I remember very vividly at the University of Louisville, where I was dealing with a lot of racism, just driving to work and
Yeah.
feeling more and more anxious as I would approach my workplace, knowing that I'm going to park, I'm going to walk by a Confederate monument, I'm going to walk down a hall with pictures of white people, and then I'm going to have to deal with racist faculty. And I'm wondering, how have these biases affected you personally?
Yeah. I mean, they're wearing, let's say the least. Um, I think they impact me the way they impact so many of us is that I think, and I talk about this in the book, is that I think it creates a challenge for our ethnic and cultural identity development. Where we work on where initially, when we show up in a white world, in a white supremacist world, our identities aren't valued. And so we just simply accept the fact that we are different and that it's better to assimilate and adopt white culture. And even then, I don't think you're fully accepted. But then to move towards this acceptance of who you are, despite those differences. And I think that's something each person of color really struggles with, whether we recognize it or not, where we move away from wanting to reduce our proximity to whiteness. And I think that's a challenging thing. And I think that I don't know that there's a point where we can just say, oh, I've dealt with that. I'm good with, because the presence of white supremacy. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about, our archaic views of racism with burning crosses on people's lawns, but the burning crosses in people's minds that show up in everyday life and systemic racism that prevent people from creating spaces, that prevent people from seeing people like you and I as a part of a larger community. That knocks us off our sense of comfort uh, on a regular basis. And like sometimes I forget that I'm a person of color. Like I'm just living my life. And then I'm reminded, oh, that's right. I forgot. Sometimes you just simply live your life, but you're very quickly reminded that you don't belong. And of course, that takes its toll. Um, for me, I think doing this work, though, really mitigates that. And I always say to people, like, if you find a way to have some sense of control over a trauma, it gives you back some sense of management of distress. And so, I think that's how I've done it, and I think that's how you've done it. I've seen you do that a lot. But yeah, it does wear. it
Yeah.
does wear. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, well, thank you for sharing that. And I also wanted to ask you, as you talk about how racism and bias affects all of us, what have you learned about racism and bias from your clients?
Oh yeah. Um, I would probably summarize it best from my favorite quote from Angela Davis, who said, "If they come for me in the morning, they're coming for you at night." And I think that statement can come across as frightening, but I think it's true that I think the more we marginalize people, like I think the more we move towards a society that starts to vilify different identities. Um, I often talk about the bias of masculinity. My master's and PhD research were in male survivors of abuse, and there was a great deal of bias there. And the same biases that prevent people of color as being seen as local people and restricting the rights of those people are the same biases that prevent men and boys from being seen as victims of abuse, white men too. So, you know, it is a slippery slope when we choose to not work on anti-racism because we move towards a society and we move towards organizations that I think allow people to hold beliefs that really differentiate people and force people into boxes, irregardless of our identities. Um, so one of the key things that I've learned is certainly that irregardless of our perceived race or ethnicities or cultures, we have far more in common than we realize. And I think if we draw on that empathy, I think we're more likely to see a greater connection between people and remove those barriers. But in order to get there, I think fear is necessary. But it's necessary that we recognize it as fear. We have a greater mindfulness and insight about that fear and why we have that fear. What thoughts come with that fear? Because the moment we identify the thoughts that come with that fear that's necessary, we can now recognize the biases we hold. And when we recognize the biases we hold, we can do that work. But that also means that dissent is necessary, right? Like we need people to push back. We can't make society better by simply just being complacent and accepting things as they are. That dissent is necessary. But along those lines, that we can't like label people who push for dissent or are dissenting voices as terrorists. And I think we're in a world that really does that, right? That we often think about those who are radicalized as threats, when really I believe that sometimes the people that are the most radicalized can be the ones that are actually trying to bring us together. And they're really speaking about disparity. And I think it's important rather than being frightened by that voice, we try to understand what level of disparity is being advocated for.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've recognized the most, sorry, I cut you off there.
Oh, no. I mean, I was just listening to what you were saying and looking at this picture of Angela Davis, who was seen as so threatening back then.
Yes,
Now she's a university professor. I mean,
yes, absolutely.
and people
Yeah.
are looking back now and everybody agrees with what she stood for then. But back then, boy, she was hated.
Well, she was considered a radical. She was considered a terrorist, right? And yet, I mean, her work was about removing barriers and decreasing disparity and bringing people together and broadening what a sense of a community was and how diverse a community can be. But I think the challenges she faced, and I think the challenges I think that I've learned from a lot of the clients that I work with, both individually and organizations, is that racism is kind of like group narcissism, you know, that it's hard for people who have that narcissism to see that they are narcissistic, that they must center themselves and their beliefs and their values, but also that when you threaten that narcissism, they attack you, they try to split you, And that's what happens is, right, the racial kind of structure kind of puts people into groups. So your issue is not like that person. You can't advocate for that person. And one of the values that I really thought is to come together. I think to really make people aware of that narcissism means that those of us who face those challenges and our allies really have to come together as a body, and set those firm boundaries and advocate for those boundaries that protect us and remove barriers for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Now, I want to ask, what are some key things, from your journey and your experience and your learning? What are some of the key things that you feel that all practitioners need to know?
Uh, so I wrote a book about it. Um,
No.
yeah, and I joke in some ways that I felt like I wrote a glorified pamphlet. Um, and I don't mean that as like I don't think I just think that a lot of people think that this is a challenging and difficult thing. And really, there's not a ton of skills that people need to have. Um, I think the work isn't about learning about others. I think this work is about learning about ourselves and the barriers that we have in our own mind that prevent us from seeing people that we perceive as different as a part of our community. And I think we've already done that work already, and with many aspects of diversity, where the more we saw people as a part of our community, the more we were better able to understand the issues tied to them. And we could, as Daryl Sue says, advocate for and negotiate on behalf of those people. Um, and, we've done that with the queer community. I'm not saying we're there and perfect, but, you don't have to be queer to understand the issues associated with coming from that community, because people see queer people as a part of our community. Again, I'm not saying we're there yet, but we've had conversations about women and women's rights, typically more white women than women of color, I would say. But because we have that conversation, because obviously we see women as a part of our community, we're able to do that very effectively. But I think this issue and this fear of being canceled, the fear of being labeled as racist, the fear of identifying our own biases, the fear of cancel culture, which I'm not a fan of, I think can really frighten people into actually utilizing the skills of empathy and cognitive flexibility that they already have, that we apply in many other ways in our lives towards different groups of people, to apply that to people of color too. But that's where I think what's necessary is that we start to build cultures that promote understanding, that promote conversation, that aren't threatening for people. I think anyone who's a person of color knows the difference between somebody who's asking to learn and versus asking to put you in a box and mean you unwell, right? Like there's anybody who's experienced racism knows the difference. And we approach it differently, right? You might roll your eyes if somebody's ignorant, but you're still happy to give them the time to have that conversation to remove ignorance. But then the subtle microaggressions that are tied to harm. And then you're like, I am not doing this. This person is not asking to learn.
Yeah.
This person is asking to attack. And so this book for me is really just about holding a mirror up,
Mm.
to yourself. It's a book about mindfulness, a, a book about thoughtful approaches to understanding how we see other people. And then all that stuff becomes a lot easier in my mind.
Mm. Well, what lessons do you think our society needs to learn to make it more inclusive? I think sometimes it's a little daunting because I think a lot of times we think about cultural competence and we think we have to learn everything about every culture. But it sounds like you're saying that it's really more about ourselves.
It is, but it's also, and I think it's also about how we define community. And I talk about this in my book, but one of the things that's always bothered me that's been like a bee in my bonnet, um, has that models of cultural competence are very anthropological. They're like human zoos that we want to inspect and learn about. It's very National Geographic. And that's one of the most offensive and worst forms of cultural competence. And that's why I labeled or titled this book, Developing Anti-Racist Cultural Competence. Because for me, this isn't about an international issue. This is a cross-cultural competence, anti-racist cultural competence is about understanding our own local communities. And I think we need to begin to switch how we look at cultural competence as beginning to understand our own community. I think the moment we're starting to learn about others and foreign cultures, I think we really slip into that alone as a bias, that white is local and that if you're of color, you're foreign.
Yeah, such a big problem with the way people think. Now, do you think there are events going on in the world today that speak to places where these lessons could be applied?
Oh, yeah. I think we're at where we are today because we've had very performative acts of inclusion by our leaders. I think what we see today is what I've spoken about is that the ability to engage in empathy and connect with people and learn about people as a part of our community exists in the average person. We have that capability. Each of us have got friends from different communities. And the moment we've opened up ourselves to understanding, the more we felt closer to, and those people became a part of our community. You know, when we have the conversations and workshops that I give with people and their biases, they're like, you know, maybe 10 years ago I would have had those biases, but then I had a friend from this community and now they're just like family. You know, I see myself as a part of their community and they see myself as a part of mine. But that's where a lot of this work is tied to leaders and professionals. Because leaders and professionals, I often think, you know, out of fear and threat or whatever the reason might be, engage in this performative garbage, you know, and here's a photograph right in the middle of all this of our prime minister bringing a little teddy bear to one of the mass graves of the Indigenous children found in a genocide of Indigenous people here in Canada due to the residential school system. I mean, to me, that's performative. And at the same time, those Indigenous communities don't have governance, don't have clean drinking water, don't have access to healthcare and services, right? So that's a performative front. And you see that those issues, like we think, and I think the narcissism of racism would like communities of color to believe, and even white communities to believe that this has nothing to do with them, but has everything to do with every single one of us. And we're seeing it all come together in the world today. You know, in our city here, we know that actually in Canada and the United States, there's a high degree of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And in our city here, there was a mass murderer, a serial killer who was actually targeting Indigenous women. And they understood that the bodies and the remains of these women that he had killed were in a garbage dump, not too far from my office, I might add. And the government refused to search that landfill for the remains of these women. And you see that protest sign, "We are human, not trash." And you see the sentiment showing up in Indigenous people in Palestine, and you see the mass graves over there of the genocide of Palestinian people in Gaza. And you see the reaction, and you say, well, those are separate issues. They are not. They are the same issue. You see here the painting of George Floyd, right? "I can't breathe. Your foot is on my neck." That is a metaphor for this, like, of the oppression that occurs systemically towards people of color. And that's painted on a wall that separates occupied territory in Palestine and Israel, right? And then you see the bombardment of Gaza there. And then you see the protests. You're seeing these protests everywhere. And right there at the bottom is a photograph of the statue of Queen Victoria in our city, torn down because of the anger towards colonial white supremacy, the defaced statue of Queen Victoria. These issues are all tied together. And we're here today because we've not taken the steps to actually move towards what actual inclusion is. And the steps that we've taken has been performative. You know, you have the White House here inviting people to celebrate Diwali, a group of people who belong to a colonial history, a colonized history, and at the same time, the American government is supporting the genocide of a colonized people abroad. So you see these performative acts are in contradiction to each other. And what we have to understand as people of color is that I think that we have been starved. And I think that we're thirsty, and we have to be careful that when people offer us crumbs of performative inclusion, sometimes our hunger makes us just want to gobble them all up. And I think sometimes we have to hold on to that hunger and let that hunger drive our activism and our change and our ability to advocate for true inclusion versus just accepting this and getting a little bit ahead in your own personal life so that, but you're putting behind other people of color and other marginalized communities. I do not believe at any way that we can advocate for one group and not the other. We cannot, absolutely. And I think what's happening in the world today is tied to a bigger issue of colonial white supremacy that exists everywhere.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that. You're leaving us with so much to think about and chew on today. How can people learn more about your work?
I've got a QR code here for my website. That's me in socks and sandals, by the way. It's a little
Fantastic fashion statement,
that
I
is
might.
not a fashion faux pas. I refuse to accept that. Um, and my little tummy. So there's a link to my website. You can actually sign up for a newsletter. I'll send out updates periodically, so you get updates that way. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well too. If you can search my name, you'll see me there. And I've posted less cake lately with everything that's happened abroad. But if you're a fan of cake and want to see a lighter side of some of my work, you can follow me on Instagram, and there's a QR code there for my link there.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having this conversation with me.
It's been fantastic. I think we might have some questions, actually.
Mm.
Thank you both very much for spending this time with us. We're so appreciative of your insights and your thoughts on all these topics that are so important to making a difference in our world. And hopefully our audience is taking this all in and taking it back to their communities. We don't have a ton of time, but there are just a few questions. This one here kind of goes back to the beginning of the presentation, Dr. Raymond. It says, you said that Canada is your country because you grew up there and your lived experiences are there. Have you chosen or been able to investigate your Tanzanian roots? And if so, what has this brought up for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think I ever disconnected from the Tanzanian roots. And I think this speaks to the sense of intersectionality. I've worked very hard, and it's not to say that it's always been perfect, because I have been accused of being a coconut sometimes. But
Okay, you have to tell people what that means.
brown on the outside, white on the inside. So, but I very much always been tied to my roots. I'm enamored with the history of Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam. I actually was a visiting professor at 3 universities in Tanzania, Muhimbili University of Health and Allied Sciences, actually where I was born. And actually I worked with a psychologist there who started working at the hospital. Actually, she came there as a nun and then went back and qualified as a psychologist because she saw the mental health stuff. And she's an Irish woman who really dedicated her life to Tanzania. But she started working at that hospital the same month that I was born. And fate just brought us together, and we ended up developing a clinical program for clinical psychology at Muhimbili University of Health and Allied Sciences. I've done a lot of development work in Tanzania with children who are formerly street kids. And then I had a visiting professor status and did a lot of development work in Zanzibar, which was our family's home community at the State University of Zanzibar and Zanzibar University. And I love like jinn stories. There's a ghost stories that come from our culture, and I've collected that. And so I'm working on some like literary works on that as well too. So I'm very much tied to it, and it is very much a part of who I am.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Maybe we have time for one more question here. How about this one? Could you speak on the concept of intergenerational trauma based on what you've seen your parents experience, what you have experienced personally? And in one of the previous presentations, you mentioned that you also have a child.
Mm.
Could you comment on this sort of intergenerational trauma component, please?
Well, I think it's really, I think we tend not to see it. And that's why I say this work is about mindfulness. I myself didn't pay attention to it. But as you can see, like I'm wearing like a buttoned down shirt with a paisley tie. Interesting enough, paisley comes from Arab and South Asian traditions, but and I've got a wool blazer behind me here, and I love that look. And I didn't recognize I love that look until I realized I like it because it looks British. And then I think back to my grandfather who was very colonial in that style. And he hated the fact that I had a beard because he used to say that that was not civilized, which is a classic British thing to say. He worked for the British government in Zanzibar. And so he had internalized that even just in terms of what he thought was appropriate for clothing. And he didn't wear cultural garb, even though that was the style. He dressed like a British person. And I think about how my father still adopted that, less strict, and now how I carry that with me. And as much as it's just my quote unquote preference, and I think we have this idea that we have this control over our own thoughts, we don't recognize the contributing forces and factors to all of our thoughts. How that intergenerational trauma of the challenges my grandfather had dealt with poverty and upward mobility, and that his upward mobility was tied to accepting a job with the British and letting go of that identity, and not just letting go of that identity, but demeaning that identity, and how that showed up in what my father thought was a well-dressed man. And now what I see is a preference, and is like, I can't get rid of that, right? Like I literally wear it on me every day. And yet I recognize that comes from colonial trauma.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you step back even further from just your own father, but into your grandfather and what their predecessors had experienced. But it goes deep.
It does.
This is I see that, we're sort of out of time here. Unfortunately, I would love to ask more and hear more from the audience, but I just want to really thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you both, Dr. Abdulrehman and Dr. Williams, for joining us today. This was just a really beautifully presented, and the interview format was wonderful. It's just a great way to share ideas and hear you both explore these topics. So I want to really express our gratitude to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
It's been great being here.